My daughter-in-law said my old suit would embarrass her husband. My son told me to leave the party. I smiled, placed the folder on his table, and walked out. The next morning, he called me 44 times. I stood there in the main lobby of Callaway Tech Solutions. Towering glass walls reflected the cold blue glow of neon lights, a symbol of modern success. I looked up at the massive sign on the wall, my chest tightening as memories came back of those sleepless nights at the kitchen table, writing deposit checks just to make sure this name would not disappear before it even had the chance to become real. I glanced down at my hands. Gray streaks of cement still clung to the edges of my nails, and the scars from hauling lumber across job sites over 40 years had never fully faded. Today I was wearing the ash-gray suit I had worn to my retirement ceremony. It hung a little loose on the shoulders, and the fabric was slightly worn, but I had pressed it carefully. I wanted to look respectable on Marcus's big day. But the moment I walked in, I realized I was a wrong note in this elegant symphony. The smell of grilled shrimp mixed with expensive perfume in the air. Marcus stood at the center of the room, glowing in a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a glass of red wine that probably cost as much as a contractor's weekly paycheck. He laughed and chatted with investors who looked at me like I was a maintenance worker who had wandered into the VIP lounge by mistake. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, glided toward me like a silk breeze. She did not look into my eyes. Instead, her heavily made-up gaze swept over my old suit with undisguised disgust. She grabbed my elbow, squeezing harder than necessary, and whispered in my ear, "Are you really wearing that, Dad, please? There are VIP guests everywhere tonight. Just go stand by the bar in the back and do not do anything strange that might affect Marcus." A chill ran down my spine, not from the building's air conditioning, but from the truth that had just revealed itself. I was not a father invited to share in the joy. I was a stain on the polished business card of my own son. Quietly, I slipped away from the crowd and stood in the shadowed corner of the bar, where servers rushed back and forth. From that distance, I could hear Marcus's voice clearly through the sophisticated sound system as he began his speech about success. He thanked the partners who had believed in him. He thanked his wonderful wife for supporting him. He even thanked his college friends for cheering him on. Then he spoke about his solo struggle, about how he had built this empire from nothing. Not a single word for the father who mortgaged his entire house in Asheville so he could have his first investment capital. Not one word for the man who quietly paid his overdue bills when his third attempt at the business failed. I touched the inside pocket of my jacket where the manila folder rested silently. I wondered what Ellen, my late wife, would think if she could see this moment. She always told me Marcus was just a boy with too much pride. But today I realized it was not pride. It was betrayal wrapped in velvet. I smiled a dry and tired smile. I was no longer sad. When you spend your entire life surveying foundations, you learn to recognize when the ground beneath a structure has already rotted away. And Marcus's foundation, no matter how magnificent it looked, was sitting on a pile of debt and ingratitude. I stepped out of the shadows and walked straight toward the main table, where the most important documents of the evening were laid out. It was time to settle the accounts. By now you are probably wondering why I prepared that manila folder and brought it with me to my son's big celebration. Welcome back to Dad's Real-Life Revenge. Before we continue the story, let me tell you why I prepared that folder in advance. But first, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second, and then we will continue. From the day Vanessa became my daughter-in-law, her eyes were never still. They were always drawn to the glittering image Marcus projected to the world, and she reserved that same look of contempt for her father-in-law. In her mind, I was nothing more than a parasite living off her husband. That is how she had always seen me. 65 years of life is enough to teach a man how to read people and situations. I knew with absolute certainty that the day Marcus reached the peak of his career would also be the day she would try to push me out of this family for good. So I made a plan. I prepared everything long in advance. And that folder was part of that plan. Because inside it was the one thing capable of restoring the dignity of a father who had been quietly erased. Let us return to the party. I stood only a few steps away from Marcus, close enough to see the beads of sweat glistening on his forehead under the stage lights, yet far enough to feel that an unbridgeable abyss lay between father and son. Marcus was passionately talking about his vision, about the future of Callaway Tech, about how he had single-handedly steered this ship through financial storms. Every word he spoke felt like a cold blade carefully carving away every trace of my existence from the story of his life. I lightly touched the old Seiko watch on my left wrist. It was the only thing Ellen had left me before she closed her eyes for the last time. I remembered that day clearly. Marcus had stood beside his mother's coffin and promised he would become a man who would make his family proud. And now he stood there radiant and powerful. But the pride inside me had shattered into pieces. He was painting the portrait of a self-made hero, a conqueror who needed no one's help. He had forgotten the nights I worked overtime at construction sites until my hands went numb just to make sure there was enough money in his account to pay his employees during the first month of his company. My eyes drifted toward Vanessa. She stood beside the wives of major investors, her red-painted lips curved into a proud smile. When our eyes accidentally met, she quickly looked away and signaled to a nearby security guard to come toward me. This humiliation was no longer just a slap in the face. It was a calculated attempt to erase my presence entirely. I felt the weight of the manila folder inside my jacket pocket. Inside were not just numbers. They were the history of sacrifice. There were checks worth $8,000, $12,000, and even crude handwritten promissory notes Marcus had signed during his most desperate moments. I had never planned to ask for that money back, not until tonight. I once believed it was simply an investment in my son's happiness. But now I understood the truth. I had been feeding a monster of arrogance. In my line of work as a contractor, if you place a steel beam in the wrong position, the entire building will begin to lean. If you use poor materials in the foundation, disaster is only a matter of time. Marcus was the magnificent structure I had poured my life into building, but I had made the most fundamental mistake. I ignored the cracks in his character. Thunderous applause erupted as Marcus finished his speech. He raised his glass to toast the prosperity of everyone in the room except the man who had given him the very foundation on which he stood. I watched him smiling at the crowd, a hollow smile. I knew that behind all the glitter Callaway Tech was operating on capital that I had personally guaranteed. I began to walk, not toward the exit, but toward the central table where Marcus would sit after stepping down from the stage. Each step across the polished marble floor felt heavy and deliberate. I no longer felt like an old man in an outdated suit. I was Richard, a contractor with 40 years of experience. And I was about to conduct the harshest foundation inspection Marcus had ever faced. I placed the manila folder on the white silk-covered table right beside Marcus's glass of red wine. I did not say a word. I simply looked straight into his eyes for a brief moment. In that glance I saw the flicker of panic of a child caught in a lie. Then I turned and walked out of the hall, leaving behind the cold neon lights and the false speech of success. Tonight the real storm was only just beginning. I walked out of the banquet hall, the sound of classical music and polite laughter fading behind the thick glass doors. Outside the parking lot was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. Night wind drifted in from the valley, carrying the familiar chill of the highlands and slipping through the worn fabric of my old suit. I climbed into my 2012 pickup truck. The engine roared to life with a rough, unapologetic growl that felt completely out of place among the polished supercars parked around me. In the rearview mirror, I looked back at the Callaway Tech Solutions building. Under the bright floodlights, it looked like a fortress made of glass. I had placed that folder right beside Marcus's wine glass, a cheap yellow manila folder that clashed sharply with the luxury of the banquet table. Inside, it was $340,200 of undeniable debt. It was the total of the material invoices I had paid for him, the bank loans whose interest I had covered on his behalf, and the personal checks I had signed when he stood on the edge of bankruptcy 2 years ago. As I drove home, the silence inside the truck felt heavy. I kept thinking about the look in Marcus's eyes when he saw the folder. It was not the look of remorse. It was the fear of a man who had suddenly realized the mask on his face had cracked. I had given him the chance to be a son. He chose to be a ruthless CEO. So, I would not behave like a soft-hearted father anymore. I would behave like a partner collecting a debt. When I arrived at my house in Asheville, I did not turn on the living room lights. I walked straight into the kitchen where everything had remained exactly the same since the day Ellen passed away. I turned on the kettle and listened to the water beginning to boil, a steady, practical sound that grounded the quiet room. I sat down in the old wooden chair, the same chair where I had spent decades calculating construction bids and project estimates. My phone began vibrating on the stone countertop. Once, twice, then again and again. The light from the screen flickered in the darkness like a pulse beating wildly. I did not pick it up. I already knew who it was. The first 14 missed calls were from Marcus. He was not calling to apologize. I knew that for certain. He was calling because he had realized that the 18% collateral stake I still held could turn his dream of going public into a pile of ashes. In construction, there is an unwritten rule. You never ignore even the smallest crack in a load-bearing beam. Marcus thought my silence and patience over the years meant weakness. In truth, it was the slow accumulation of an enormous structural load. And tonight that beam had finally snapped. I looked at Ellen's photograph sitting on the windowsill. She was smiling gently, her eyes almost asking me a question. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I gave a small nod to the empty room. I realized I had lived too quietly since she died. I tried to remain useful without being present, and in the process Marcus began to see me as a resource instead of a human being. He used my money the way people use air, naturally, without gratitude. Tonight I will sleep deeply. Tomorrow I will go see Gerald. I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the table. The silence returned, but this time it was no longer frightening. It was the silence of a soldier before stepping into the final battle to protect what remained of his honor. $340,200 was not just money. It was the value of the kindness Marcus had thrown away, and I would collect it back. Every single dollar. The next morning I woke up before the sun had even begun to rise over the pine ridges of Asheville. The phone on the kitchen table lay silent, but when I flipped it over the screen lit up with a long list of notifications. By morning he had called me 44 times. I did not rush. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, its bitter aroma drifting through the wooden house and bringing with it a strange clarity. I sat there staring at the blinking numbers on the screen, almost feeling Marcus's panic vibrating through the glass. I was not angry. I was simply balancing the books. That sentence kept repeating in my head as I flipped through my old construction journals. Marcus thought I was just a forgetful old man who liked reminiscing about blueprints and measuring tapes. What he did not know was that an experienced contractor keeps every receipt from a single screw to an entire truckload of fresh concrete. In my records, every dollar that went into Callaway Tech was marked with sweat and the expectations of a father. When I drove to Gerald's office, the early morning sun was just beginning to spill over the hills. Gerald was an old friend, a civil contract attorney with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. I placed the folder on his desk. Gerald looked through the debt documents, then looked at me again. His expression hardened when he saw the checks for $8,000, $12,000, and $15,000 written one after another over the course of 3 years. "Richard, do you realize this total is nearly half the value of your house?" Gerald asked quietly. I nodded, a tight feeling forming in my chest. Of course I knew. I also knew Marcus had promised to pay it all back when the company became profitable. And now the company was valued in the millions of dollars. Yet he chose to treat me like a stranger at last night's celebration. I thought back to the days when Ellen was still alive. She used to say Marcus had great ambition, and that we had to be the launch pad for him. And I did exactly that. I became the launch pad to the point of wearing myself down. But a launch pad cannot be stepped on forever without pushing back. If a structure's foundation is unstable, the contractor's duty is to point it out before the entire building collapses and drags everything down with it. Marcus called again while I was still in the lawyer's office. Gerald gestured for me to put the phone on speaker. Marcus's voice burst through the room, not with remorse, but with anger trembling underneath it. "What the hell are you doing, Dad? You left that pile of papers on the table in front of my investors. Do you have any idea you almost ruined my funding round?" I took a deep breath. My voice came out so calm that it surprised even me. "I didn't ruin anything, Marcus. I only reminded you about the foundation you're standing on. Those numbers are the truth. And the truth never ruins a good deal, unless that deal is built on a lie." Gerald began drafting the first formal legal demand letter. I sat there watching the black lines of text appear on the clean white page. This was no longer just about money. This was a fight to reclaim dignity. Marcus needed to understand something. A parent's love is priceless. But basic decency between human beings always carries a cost when someone decides to trample on it. The 44th call ended in silence. And the real battle had only just begun. Gerald tapped his fountain pen lightly against the oak desk, the dry sound echoing through the office filled with the scent of old paper. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his voice thoughtful. "Richard, If we send this letter, the relationship between you and Marcus will never be the same again. Are you sure about this? I looked out the window where bright golden sunlight in Asheville danced across the leaves of the trees. I'm sure, Gerald. A house with a rotten foundation cannot be repaired by repainting the walls. You have to tear it down and build it again from the ground up. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small yellowed photograph. In the picture, Ellen was standing in front of the first house we had ever built with our own hands. She was smiling brightly, her eyes filled with faith in the future. Marcus owed me $340,200, but he owed Ellen something even greater. He owed her the decent life she always believed he would grow into. I could not allow the money we had saved during our hardest years to become fuel for the vanity of a cold-hearted CEO. My old will lay on the desk. In it, I had left everything to my two children, Marcus and Claire, split evenly. But today I asked Gerald to draft an amendment with ironclad conditions. I decided the inheritance would still be divided fairly, but with one requirement. Marcus would receive his share only if he repaid the entire debt within 24 months. If he failed to do so, that money would belong neither to him nor to me. It would go directly into the Ellen Scholarship Fund for underprivileged architecture students. I wanted to make the weight of what I had given him unmistakably clear. Marcus loved talking about surplus value and profit margins. So this would be the lesson in opportunity cost that business school had never taught him. The cost of ingratitude is the permanent loss of trust and family legacy. As Gerald began typing the new provisions, I felt a current run down my spine. This was not blind revenge. This was restoring balance. In 40 years of working as a contractor, I learned that fairness is the only measure that keeps a structure from collapsing. I did not want to destroy Marcus. I wanted him to face the truth. He was never self-made. He was raised and supported by the sweat and blood of a contractor he had just thrown out of a party. I thought about Claire, the daughter who had always quietly stood by my side. She had never asked for a single dollar. Instead, she constantly worried about my health. The contrast between my two children made my chest ache. I was doing this for Claire, for Ellen, and for my own dignity. I did not want to leave this world knowing I had raised a man arrogant enough to believe the world owed him everything. Let me ask you something. If you discovered your children were slowly becoming strangers filled with ingratitude, would you stay silent and endure it? Or would you make a bold move to teach them the final lesson of your life? Leave a comment and tell me what you think about this will. Gerald slid the draft toward me. I picked up the pen. My hand did not tremble. As the ink soaked into the paper, I knew I had just signed the death sentence for Marcus's arrogance. I stood up feeling a little lighter. The direct confrontation was about to begin. And this time I would not step back. 3 days later, Gerald's letter was sent by certified mail with a signed confirmation of receipt. I sat in the woodworking shop behind my house, running my fingers over a block of rough oak that had not yet been planed. I liked the feel of raw wood. It did not know how to lie the way people did. When the phone on the wooden table began vibrating violently, I did not even need to look to know it was the earthquake called Marcus. I let it ring 5 times before slowly pressing the answer button. What came through the line was not a voice. It was a scream. "Have you lost your mind, Dad?" Marcus shouted. His voice echoed through the speaker, tearing apart the quiet afternoon in Asheville. "You sent a legal demand letter to my office, right? While the lawyers from the investment firm are reviewing our company documents. Are you trying to destroy everything I've built? Do you have any idea this stunt could cost me millions of dollars in investment?" I set the oak block down and took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady despite the sadness rising inside me. "I'm not destroying anything, Marcus. I'm simply clarifying the weight of what I gave you. You owe me more than money. You owe me the basic decency one human being owes another." I paused, listening to his furious breathing on the other end of the phone. "You keep talking about millions of dollars, but you've forgotten the checks worth a few thousand that saved you from foreclosure 3 years ago. You treat my help like it was your right, and my presence like it was a burden. You're blackmailing me," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking now with a hint of fear. "This is revenge because Vanessa said a few unpleasant things to you that night, isn't it?" I smiled bitterly. "You still don't understand, Marcus. If a foundation fails because you used cheap materials, it's not the inspector's fault for pointing it out. It's the inevitable result of dishonesty from the beginning. That $340,200 belonged to your mother and me. I co-signed your loans not so you could turn them into expensive tuxedos or lavish parties where I wasn't even welcome. I signed because I believed in you. But now that belief is gone. At that moment I realized I had been far too generous over the years. I had allowed him to believe that everything in life was free and could be achieved by stepping on other people's shoulders. But in the world of a contractor, everything has its price. If you borrow money to build a wall, you pay for the bricks. If you borrow your father's reputation to build your career, you cannot throw him away like a rotten plank once the building is finished. I'm not paying you a single cent, Marcus snarled before hanging up. The silence returned, but this time it carried the taste of an unforgiving war. I looked down at my rough hands, the same hands that once held him when he was a newborn child. Now those same hands would have to dismantle the illusion of greatness he had built around himself. I stood up and brushed the wood dust from my shirt. Marcus believed he could defeat me with expensive lawyers and polished speeches. But he had forgotten something. I was the one who taught him how to stand. And I was the one who knew exactly where the fatal weaknesses were in the structure he was trying so desperately to protect. This confrontation had only just entered the stage of the load test. After the explosive phone call with Marcus, I needed a moment of quiet. I drove into town to meet Claire at a small Thai restaurant tucked behind the main street. The smell of lemongrass ginger and hot chili helped wash away the bitter taste of betrayal. Claire was already there, calm in her simple office clothes. Her eyes looked exactly like Ellen's. They always seemed able to see through whatever armor I tried to build around myself. "You look tired, Dad," Claire said, sliding a plate of pad thai toward me. I looked at my daughter's small hands and remembered the years she paid her own college tuition by working part-time at the library without ever complaining. She was the perfect opposite of Marcus, steady and strong in a quiet way. I told her about the legal demand letter and the furious reaction from her brother. "You're not angry with me, are you?" I asked, my chest tightening. Claire set down her chopsticks and looked straight into my eyes. "Dad, a home is dignity. And dignity is something a person deserves after a lifetime of hard work. Marcus has confused success with arrogance. He thinks he can build a towering structure without caring whether the foundation beneath it is made from the blood of his own family. If you don't stop him now, he'll hurt even more people." Claire's words were like a bucket of cold water poured over the last trace of doubt inside me. I realized I was doing the right thing, not just for myself, but to protect the values Ellen had spent her life building. In construction, if a slab foundation shifts out of alignment, you cannot simply cover it with plaster. You have to tear it out and rebuild it properly. Marcus was that crooked foundation. He needed to understand that love is not a blank check he can cash whenever he wants. I remembered the old days when the three of us would go hiking together. Marcus was always the one who wanted to climb the highest peak just to shout to the world that he had made it. Back then, I was proud of his ambition. But now, I understood something. That mountain means nothing if you have to step on other people's heads to reach the top. Claire reached across the table and held my hand. Her warm grip was the complete opposite of Vanessa's cold, calculating touch at the party that night. That warmth reminded me that I still had something worth fighting for. I was not alone in this battle for justice. I was fighting so Marcus might one day learn how to become a decent human being again, even if the price was the collapse of the glittering ego he had built around himself. Dinner ended, but my determination had only begun to burn brighter. I handed Claire a copy of the new will. She read through it briefly and smiled. "Mom would be proud of you." That was all I needed to face the mediation meeting next week. Marcus believed he could overpower me with money and influence. But he had forgotten one thing. I was the one who held the original blueprint of his life. I stepped outside the restaurant and took a deep breath of the night air. The quiet of Asheville no longer felt sad. It felt like the silence before a massive structural inspection where every hidden flaw would finally be exposed under the light of justice. And I was ready to show Marcus the true weight of a forgotten charter. The mediation room was on the 12th floor of a modern office building, where the smell of fresh paperwork and artificial air freshener created an atmosphere so sterile it felt unsettling. I sat on one side of a long, polished wooden table with Gerald beside me, quietly organizing the documents. Across from us sat Marcus and Vanessa. Marcus wore a dark navy suit. His face was tight, his eyes bloodshot, as if he had not slept for several nights. Vanessa sat beside him, the heavy scent of her expensive perfume almost suffocating. It clashed sharply with the smell of oak wood and construction dust that had been part of my life for decades. At the head of the table sat Dr. Patricia Holcomb, a woman with razor-sharp eyes and a calm, almost icy composure. She glanced through both folders of documents before clearing her throat. "We are here to find a mutual resolution before this matter proceeds further into public court." Marcus did not even wait for her to finish. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice hoarse from restrained anger. "The only solution is for my father to withdraw this ridiculous demand. Do you have any idea my investors are already asking questions? They see a debt lawsuit coming from my own father and they assume my company has cash flow problems. You are killing me, Dad." I looked at my son, and a quiet sadness moved through me. He still believed this was about money. He still believed the name Callaway Tech was the center of the universe. Slowly, I slid an old invoice across the table toward him, a document dated 2022. "Marcus, this isn't about killing anyone. This is about inspecting a structure that has been neglected for too long. You say I'm hurting you. Then what would you call throwing your father out of that party the other night?" "Respect," Vanessa spoke up, her voice sharp and dripping with sarcasm. "That was simply a misunderstanding about the dress code, Mr. Richard. We could not allow strategic partners to see an elderly construction worker appearing in the VIP section. It would have looked unprofessional." Her words struck my pride like an electric shock. I smiled, the kind of smile Gerald knew well, the kind that meant a steel response was coming. "Professional, you say? Then let's talk about professionalism. In the world of a contractor, professionalism means that when you borrow materials to build a house, you pay the invoice. Professionalism means that when you promise to repay money, once your company becomes profitable, you don't suddenly pretend to forget once your bank account reaches 7 figures. I leaned slightly forward. "I'm not destroying your life, Marcus. I'm only reminding you that no matter how large your shadow becomes, it still begins with the feet standing on the ground I gave you." Dr. Holcomb wrote something down in her notebook, then turned toward Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, do you deny that your father paid these debts on behalf of your company?" Marcus hesitated. He glanced at Vanessa, then at his lawyer. He tried to argue that the money had been a family gift, voluntary support from parents to their child. I listened to his defense with an empty feeling in my chest. Every word he spoke felt like another brick being removed from the last wall of trust between us. He was trying to turn my sacrifices into something ordinary, a gift he never had to take responsibility for. But he had forgotten one small detail I had carefully preserved. I opened the manila folder and pulled out a printed screenshot of a message from 2 years earlier. In the message, Marcus himself had written, "Dad, save me one more time. When the Series A funding round succeeds and the company becomes profitable, I'll pay you back the full amount with 18% interest." I placed the paper on the table in front of Dr. Holcomb. A heavy silence filled the room. Marcus stared at the page, his face drained from red to pale. The legal battle was no longer built on accusations alone. Now there was steel evidence. And I, Richard, the old contractor they had looked down on, had just laid the first brick of a new structure of justice. One that Marcus would have no choice but to face. The silence in the mediation room now hung over Marcus like a massive block of concrete suspended above his head. He stared at the printed message on the table, the words he himself had typed during a desperate night 2 years earlier. "I'll pay you back 18%. Those numbers were no longer an empty promise. They were steel proof of a formal financial agreement. Vanessa tried to speak, but Dr. Holcomb raised her hand, signaling for silence. She looked at Marcus with a firm expression. "Mr. Marcus, this is not a gift. This is a conditional loan. And as the guarantor for your credit obligations over the past 3 years, your father has every right to enforce these terms." Marcus suddenly shot to his feet. His chair scraped across the floor with a sharp screech. "What is this supposed to do? Dad, humiliate me? Do you realize that if I have to surrender 18% of my current equity value to repay you, my control of Callaway Tech will be at risk? You're destroying my legacy." I remained seated, my hands folded calmly on the table. I looked straight into his eyes. There was no anger in mine, only deep disappointment. "Legacy, Marcus. You built this company on inflated numbers and polished appearances. I built my life with cement and the checks I signed so you wouldn't end up sleeping on the street. A structure that looks magnificent on the outside, but rests on a foundation of deceit and ingratitude, can never be called a legacy. It's just a trap, waiting to collapse." I stood and slowly walked to the window, looking down at the busy traffic below. Marcus, in construction, there's a concept called load capacity. When a beam carries too much weight without reinforcement, it breaks. I've carried your weight for too long. Vanessa's words that night, the contempt in your eyes when you looked at my old suit, that was the final drop. The last bit of weight that caused the beam of my patience to collapse. Gerald slid the settlement document across the table toward Marcus. The terms were clear. Marcus had to acknowledge the debt and sign a repayment schedule within 24 months, or I would immediately activate my collateral claim to 18% of the company's shares. If that happened, investors would likely withdraw because of the lack of transparency from their CEO. Marcus picked up the pen. His hand trembled. He looked at me, and for the first time in years I saw the frightened child in his eyes. But this time I would not pull him into my arms. Marcus signed. The scratch of the pen on paper sounded like the collapse of a sandcastle. Vanessa sank back into her chair. The proud expression she always wore had faded into a pale mask of makeup and silence. The game was over. The truth had stepped fully into the light. I picked up the signed copy and carefully placed it back inside the manila folder. I felt no triumph, only relief. It was as if a massive stone had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I walked out of the mediation room without turning back to look at Marcus again. I needed to go home, back to Asheville, where real values still existed. But don't leave just yet, because there is an ending every parent hopes for, a rebirth. A late apology from Marcus that is still waiting to be heard. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. An old contractor in a worn suit. But his shoulders were straight again. I was no longer a discarded father. I was Richard Calloway, the man who had just completed the most important structural inspection of his life. And a new chapter was waiting for me in Asheville. 6 months after that fateful mediation, I stood on a hillside at the Piedmont Housing Forward construction site. Wind from the mountains swept across the ridge, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. In front of me were not glittering glass towers, but sturdy wooden frames of homes, meant for working families. This was the affordable housing project, where I had invested the first installment. Marcus repaid. To me, housing is dignity. And dignity is something every person deserves after a lifetime of hard work. I bent down and picked up an orange survey flag from the ground. My hands were still rough, but my spirit had found its old sense of peace again. The numbers and debts had been replaced with blueprints for a real community. Here no one looked at my dusty work jacket with contempt. They looked at me with the respect reserved for a contractor who knows how to build trust from the very first brick. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Marcus. I took a deep breath and answered. His voice no longer carried the shouting or arrogance I had grown used to. Instead, there was a long pause. Then a low voice, heavy with exhaustion. "Dad, I'm standing at Mom's grave." Marcus told me he had started attending therapy sessions after Vanessa filed for divorce when the company began struggling with reputation problems. He admitted something painful that I had known for a long time. He had deliberately made me look small so he could feel bigger. He had turned me into a footnote in his own life to hide the truth that he could never truly stand without the shoulders I had given him. It was a late apology, but it was sincere. I looked toward the horizon where the evening sunlight was painting the mountains red, and I felt a quiet forgiveness begin to settle into my heart. Never make the people you love feel invisible just to feed your own pride. That was the most expensive lesson Marcus had to learn, and it was the message I wanted to leave behind for the world. Life is not a polished speech. Life is the small technical details. It is the drainage beneath a foundation. It is the way we treat each other after the stage lights have gone dark. I ended the call and looked out at the homes slowly taking shape. I saw Claire standing beside the architect Deja. The two of them were discussing the plans for the solar energy system. My daughter's presence, the warmth of real family, was the greatest reward I could ever receive. I touched the old Seiko watch on my wrist and quietly told Ellen that everything had finally turned out all right. We had rebuilt the foundation even though it had once seemed too cracked to save. Richard stood at the construction site watching the survey flags flutter in the wind, feeling for the first time that his life truly belonged to him. I was no longer a financial tool, no longer a father pushed to the sidelines. I was a builder, the contractor of my own destiny. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, do us a small favor that takes only a second. Subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it helps you join a community where you can discover the best stories as soon as they are released. I turned back to my blueprints. The Asheville sunset was beautiful. It was not as dazzling as the blue neon lights of Callaway Tech, but it was real, and it warmed the heart of an old contractor. Every debt had been settled. Every piece of dignity had been reclaimed, and the true dawn had finally begun.